Imagine a universe where the most powerful weapon ever devised is also the most forbidden one, where a beam of focused light, something humanity has wielded since the 20th century, becomes so catastrophically dangerous in the wrong context that entire civilizations agree, silently and permanently, never to use it. Not because they lack the courage, not because they forgot how, but because the consequences of that single interaction, light meeting shield, are so total, so indiscriminate, so perfectly annihilating, that even the most ruthless military commanders in the known universe refuse to pull that trigger. Welcome to the mechanics of interstellar warfare. This is a world built not on the logic of escalation, but on the logic of constraint. A cosmos where the blade is mightier than the rifle, where the slowest strike wins, and where the silence between the stars is the most honest sound in the universe. Tonight, we are going to travel through all of it. We will descend into the subatomic physics of what happens when a Holtzman shield meets a Lasgun beam. We will trace the strange, almost meditative calculus of slow blade combat. We will drift through the acoustic loneliness of a deep space vessel, feel the psychological weight of relativistic travel, and finally, we will fade into the low-resonant hum of a fold drive, bending the fabric of space itself. So settle in, let your breathing slow, because what we are about to explore is one of the most intellectually rich, most beautifully strange corners of all speculative fiction. And by the end of it, if we do this right, you will be somewhere very far from here. Let us begin at the beginning, with light, with a weapon so simple and so elegant that it feels almost naive to call it the centerpiece of an apocalypse. In the universe created by Frank Herbert across his Dune novels, the lasgun is exactly what it sounds like. A directed energy weapon, a continuous wave laser, capable of cutting through nearly any material with precision and speed. It is the military sidearm of soldiers, the tool of assassins, the long-range weapon of choice for anyone who needs to project lethal force across a distance. In isolation, it is extraordinary. Clean, fast, essentially silent, a beam of coherent light traveling at the speed of light itself, carrying enough energy per photon to ionize matter on contact. For centuries of the Imperium, lasguns sat alongside shields as the two dominant technologies of personal and military defense. And for most of that time, no one fired one at the other, because everyone knew what happened when they did. The Holtzman shield is the other half of this equation, and to understand why its interaction with a lasgun is so catastrophic, we need to understand how the shield itself works. The Holtzman effect, named for the mathematician Theo Holtzman, whose theoretical work predates the events of the novels by thousands of years, is a manipulation of the quantum mechanical properties of space itself. A Holtzman field generator projects a localized distortion, a kind of pressurized barrier created by folding low-level dimensional stress across a permeable membrane. What this produces, practically speaking, is a shimmer, a faint, luminous haze visible under certain lighting conditions, hanging just millimeters from the skin of the wearer or the hull of a vessel. The field does not stop matter outright. It resists it. Specifically, it resists velocity. The faster an object moves toward the field boundary, the greater the resistance it generates. A bullet traveling at several hundred meters per second hits that field boundary and encounters exponentially increasing resistance as it crosses the threshold. The kinetic energy is absorbed, dispersed, reflected. The bullet slows. And if it slows enough before penetrating, it stops entirely. This is a physics principle that Herbert extrapolated from real quantum mechanical concepts. The idea that a field could be velocity sensitive is not pure fantasy. In the real world, certain non-Newtonian fluids, like a mixture of cornstarch and water, become rigid under sudden high-velocity impact, but remain yielding under slow, steady pressure. Herbert scaled this concept to an energy field, made it elegant, made it wearable, and in doing so created one of the most consequential technological constraints in all of speculative fiction. The shield stops fast things. It does not stop slow things. A blade moving at human walking speed, pressed deliberately against the field boundary, will pass through. A high-velocity projectile will not. And a lasgun beam, a continuous wave laser, travels at the speed of light. There is no velocity faster than that in any known physics, real or fictional. When that beam hits a Holtzman field, the interaction is not a deflection. It is not an absorption. It is a catastrophic feedback loop. Here is where the physics becomes genuinely extraordinary and genuinely terrifying. When a high-energy photon stream, which is what a lasgun beam is, interacts with the dimensional stress matrix of a Holtzman field, the two systems do not simply cancel each other out, they resonate. The photons do not pass through the field, and they do not bounce off it. Instead, the energy of the beam couples with the quantum mechanical distortion of the shield itself, feeding back into the field generator and amplifying in a cascade of increasingly violent subatomic interactions. The result is something the Dune universe calls a pseudo-atomic explosion. The word pseudo here is not meant to minimize it. It is used to distinguish the event from a nuclear fission or fusion reaction, which releases energy by splitting or combining atomic nuclei. What a lasgun shield interaction produces is different. It is a catastrophic collapse of the local dimensional stress field, releasing accumulated energy not as radiation expanding from a point source, but as an omnidirectional wave of subatomic volatility that propagates outward through both matter and energy without distinction. In practical terms, both the person firing the lasgun and the person wearing the shield die, along with everyone and everything within a radius that cannot be predicted with any precision before the fact. This unpredictability is crucial. If the explosion were reliably calculable, it might still be tactically useful under certain circumstances. A commander might decide that the sacrifice of one soldier to destroy an entire enemy formation is an acceptable exchange. Militaries have made worse calculations throughout history, but the blast radius of a lasgun shield interaction is not consistent. It depends on the power setting of the lasgun, the charge level of the shield, the exact angle and duration of contact, and several quantum mechanical variables that cannot be determined in advance. Sometimes the explosion is the size of a room. Sometimes it is the size of a city block. Sometimes it is the size of a small town. No military doctrine can survive a weapon whose yield is fundamentally unknowable. You cannot plan around an explosion that might kill 10 people or 10,000. You cannot build tactical frameworks around pure chaos. And so over centuries, over millennia, the ruling powers of the Imperium arrived at an unspoken but universal consensus. Lasguns and shields are not to be used in the same theater of conflict. Soldiers carry one or the other. Ships are equipped with one or the other. The combination is not prohibited by law in most contexts, though some of the great houses codified the prohibition formally. It is prohibited by something deeper than law, by the cold, rational recognition that mutual destruction is not a strategy, it is the end of strategy. This is the first and most important lesson of Holtzman field physics. The most powerful weapon is the one that makes itself obsolete. Now, to understand what this prohibition actually did to warfare across the Imperium, we need to follow the logic of the slow blade. When high-velocity projectile weapons are rendered useless against shielded opponents, and when directed energy weapons are mutually suicidal against shielded opponents, the entire architecture of military conflict has to be rebuilt from the ground up. And what emerges from that rebuilding is something that, to a modern observer, looks almost medieval. The knife, the sword, the dueling blade. Not because the Imperium forgot how to make guns, not because metallurgy somehow surpassed physics, but because the Holtzman shield's velocity-dependent resistance creates a very specific window of opportunity. A blade moving slowly enough will pass through the field and reach the skin beneath it. And so the entire martial tradition of the Imperium is built around the discipline of controlled, deliberate, measured blade work. To appreciate how strange this is, consider what it asks of a soldier. In conventional warfare, a combatant's primary job is to deliver lethal force at a distance. The farther you can kill, the safer you are. Distance is survival. The entire history of human military technology, from the thrown spear to the longbow to the rifle to the guided missile, is a history of increasing lethality at increasing range. The Holtzman shield inverts this completely. Distance is now irrelevant if your enemy is shielded. A rifle is useless against a shield. A rocket is useless against a shield. The only way to kill a shielded opponent is to get close, uncomfortably, lethally, personally close, within arm's reach, close enough to look them in the eye. And then, counterintuitively, you must slow down. The physical mechanics of this are fascinating when you break them down. A Holtzman field does not have a single fixed resistance threshold. The resistance increases smoothly and continuously with velocity. A blade moving very fast hits almost as much resistance as a bullet. A blade moving very slowly encounters almost none. There is a theoretical minimum velocity, below which the field offers no resistance at all. And that velocity is somewhere around the speed of a deliberate, conscious walking pace. In practice, what this means for a fighter is that the killing stroke must be performed with the same measured, unhurried control as a Tai Chi movement. You press the blade against the shimmer of the field and you feel the resistance, that faint electric pushback of the dimensional membrane, and then you apply steady, controlled pressure. Not force, pressure. The blade passes through not by overpowering the field, but by underperforming its threshold. You slip through the gap in the physics. This is why the Fremen of Arrakis use the phrase correctly when they say, the slow blade penetrates the shield. It is not a metaphor. It is the literal physical law governing every armed engagement in the Imperium. The training traditions that grew up around this combat reality are extraordinary. And they are described in considerable detail across the Dune novels and in the supplementary lore developed by Herbert's son Brian and co-author Kevin J. Anderson. The most formalized of these traditions belongs to the great houses and their warrior retainers. But the most famous combat school in the Imperium is associated with the island planet of Ginaz. The Swordmasters of Ginaz represent the apex of close quarters martial training, and their curriculum is not simply about swordsmanship. It is about the philosophy of controlled violence, about learning to inhabit a state of absolute calm while performing actions that could end a human life. A Swordmaster of Ginaz can, in theory, modulate the velocity of their blade mid-stroke, not as a conscious calculation, but as a trained reflex, an embodied understanding of the physics so deep it operates below the level of thought. They can begin a strike at fighting speed, too fast, and slow it precisely at the moment of contact with the field boundary, threading the needle between the speed that the shield stops and the speed that kills. Duncan Idaho, one of the central figures in the Dune saga, and arguably the most recurring character across all 6 of Herbert's original novels, is a Swordmaster of Ginaz. His combat abilities are described in almost reverent terms by other characters. He is not fast in the way a reflex is fast. He is precise in the way a surgeon is precise. Every movement economical, every engagement controlled, every blade placement deliberate. And this precision has a psychological dimension that extends far beyond the physical. Because when you know that the fastest strike loses, when you've internalized that rushing forward with maximum aggression is suicidal, you develop a profoundly different relationship with danger. You learn to meet violence with stillness, to answer urgency with patience. The slow blade combat tradition is, in a very real sense, a meditation practice with lethal stakes. It is perhaps the universe's most extreme argument for mindfulness. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood, the secretive order of genetically and psychologically enhanced women who operate as advisors, diplomats, and power brokers across the Imperium, carry this principle even further. Their training in what they call the weirding way emphasizes not speed or strength, but precision and efficiency. A Bene Gesserit adept in combat is watching her opponent not for their movements, but for the involuntary microsignals, the subtle tension in a shoulder, the flicker of focus in an eye, the shift of weight through a hip that precede a movement by fractions of a second. She is not faster, she is earlier. She has already responded before the attack has consciously begun. Lady Jessica, the concubine of Duke Leto Atreides and mother of Paul, demonstrates this in the early chapters of the first novel, when she disables trained guards not through superior strength, but through the application of precise force to vulnerable nerve clusters at exactly the right moment. Her body is not a weapon in the conventional sense. It is an instrument calibrated to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of other bodies with the minimum possible expenditure of energy. This is the fighting tradition the Holtzman shield created. Not brute force and slow motion, but intelligence applied at the molecular level of physical interaction. And this tradition, built from necessity, became culture, became ritual, became the defining aesthetic of power across the Imperium, where the quality of one's personal guard and of one's own blade skills was as much a political signal as the size of one's fleet. But warfare in the Dune universe is not fought only at the personal scale of dueling blades. It is also fought in space, between ships, across the void between worlds. And the physics of the Holtzman shield and the lasgun deterrent reshape that dimension of conflict just as profoundly. Let us drift now into the deeper silence, into the long-haul vessel pushing through the emptiness between planetary systems, into the acoustic and psychological reality of a crew living with the knowledge that they are, at any given moment, the only human beings within billions of kilometers of anything. The first thing to understand about deep space travel in the Dune universe is that it is not clean and fast the way it is in most science fiction. There's no instant jump from one star system to another, no comfortable transit corridor, no antiseptic bridge crew calmly monitoring instruments while the stars streak by. Travel through the Imperium requires folding space itself, a process managed by the Guild Navigators. These are human beings who have been so thoroughly mutated by the spice melange that they have developed a limited form of prescience, the ability to perceive safe pathways through folded space. The experience of being in non-space is described in Herbert's texts with deliberate vagueness as something the human nervous system does not parse easily. A sensory absence so total that the mind fills it with noise. And during this time, the ship's environment is entirely mechanical. The recycled air moving through conduits, the low vibration of the containment fields, the slow rhythmic pulse of the life support system cycling through their sequences. These are not incidental details. They are the psychological infrastructure that keeps a crew functional across the months and years of interstellar travel. In a vessel crossing the void, sound is not a luxury. It is a necessity. The ambient acoustic signature of a ship, its hum, its rhythm, its steady mechanical breath, is the only sensory evidence that the universe still exists and is still operating normally. When that sound changes, when a frequency drops, or a cycle skips, or an unfamiliar vibration enters the hull, every experienced crew member feels it before they consciously register it. The body knows the ship's sound the way it knows its own heartbeat. The life support recyclers are particularly significant in this context. They perform the unglamorous but essential work of processing the crew's exhalations, removing carbon dioxide, replenishing oxygen, managing humidity and temperature in an environment where the nearest natural atmosphere is years away. They run continuously. They run at a fixed frequency. And over the duration of a long transit, their sound becomes the most comforting thing in the universe. The proof that the system is working, that the air is breathable, that nothing critical has failed. There is a psychological literature in the Dune universe around the phenomenon that crew members and long-haul travelers sometimes develop what the medical texts call void bond, a deep emotional attachment not to people or places, but to the mechanical rhythms of the ship itself. Counselors embedded in long transit crews are trained to monitor for this, because void bond, while offering short-term psychological comfort, can become a disorder when it begins to replace human connection entirely. The person who has void bonded no longer finds comfort in conversation. They find it in the sound of the recyclers. They sleep only when the ship's vibration is within its normal parameters. They become agitated in port, in the relative silence of a docked vessel, with its systems at minimum. They need the hum. And out in the long transit, surrounded by billions of kilometers of nothing, it is very easy to understand why. Relativistic travel adds another dimension to this psychological landscape. Even with Holtzman fold technology, Not all transit is instantaneous. Certain short-haul or in-system trips use conventional drive technology, and at the velocities required for practical interstellar maneuvering, time dilation becomes a genuine experiential reality. A crew member who spends 20 years in relativistic transit ages, less than those years suggest. They return to worlds that have moved on without them. They outlive people who were older when they left. The Mentat and Suk medical traditions both address the cognitive effects of time dilation. The mind does not simply accept the discrepancy between subjective time and calendar time. It struggles with it. It imposes its own narrative, its own structure, trying to reconcile the felt experience of 4 months with the fact that 7 years have passed on the planet below. Dreams become strange. Memory becomes unreliable. The self becomes, in some ways, a temporal artifact, a being displaced slightly from the present by the physics of velocity. Now, let us look upward from the surface. Let us look at the tactical situation that all of this technology creates in orbit around a defended planet. In the Dune universe, the physics of the Holtzman shield and the Lasgun deterrent do not merely affect personal combat. They reshape the entire architecture of planetary defense. A planet protected by sufficiently distributed shield generators is, for practical purposes, impossible to bombard from orbit. Any kinetic impactor moving fast enough to be tactically useful hits the shield boundary at velocities that trigger the explosion risk. Any lasgun fired from orbit at a shielded surface creates a catastrophic feedback event. Orbital bombardment, the oldest and crudest form of space warfare, is removed from the tactical menu entirely. What this means for an invading force is staggering. There is no softening up the target from a safe distance. There is no raining destruction on the defensive forces below while remaining comfortably beyond their reach. To take a shielded planet, you have to land on it. You have to put boots on the ground. You have to fight the people defending it in person, at close range, with blades and slow weapons, under the same physics that governs every other armed engagement in the Imperium. The great houses understand this. Their military planning is built entirely around the assumption that orbital superiority does not translate into ground superiority. You can control space above a planet and still lose the planet entirely if you cannot win the ground campaign. And the ground campaign, on a world defended by determined, shield-trained fighters, is a horrific proposition. The Fremen of Arrakis represent perhaps the most extreme example of this. A pre-industrial population, essentially, with no space navy, no orbital assets, no conventional military infrastructure, but shielded, trained in slow blade combat from childhood, fighting on terrain they know with an intimacy that no invader can match. The Harkonnen occupation of Arrakis lasted decades, but it never achieved genuine control of the deep desert interior. The Fremen simply could not be bombed into submission, could not be suppressed from orbit, had to be fought, person to person, blade to blade, in conditions that the Fremen survived and the Harkonnen soldiers did not. Herbert was making an argument here that goes beyond military logistics. He was drawing a deliberate parallel to real-world insurgency and occupation dynamics. The technologically superior force that cannot translate its technological advantage into genuine control. The indigenous population that leverages terrain and willingness to absorb losses into a form of resistance that outlasts any conventional military campaign. Arrakis is Vietnam. Arrakis is Afghanistan. Arrakis is every occupied territory where the mathematics of superior firepower fail to account for the mathematics of determined resistance. But it is also, simultaneously, a precise physical argument. The technology of the Dune universe is not lazy allegory. The physics genuinely prevents the thing Herbert wanted to prevent: the clean, distant, consequence-free application of overwhelming force. The Holtzman shield and the Lasgun deterrent together create a universe where violence is always personal, always proximate, always costly to both parties. There is no such thing as a safe war in the Imperium. There is only the question of who bleeds more. The geometry of orbital insertion trajectories under these conditions becomes one of the most complex and intellectually demanding fields in the Imperium's military science. If you cannot bombard from orbit, you must deliver ground forces to the surface. And delivering ground forces to the surface of a defended planet is extraordinarily dangerous. The planet's defenders know you are coming. They have sensor arrays covering every viable approach vector. They have anti-personnel systems optimized for killing troops during the fragile moment when a landing craft decelerates through the lower atmosphere. The science of orbital insertion is described in fragmentary detail across the novels and in the appendices, and what emerges is a picture of extraordinary mathematical sophistication applied to what is essentially a very old problem. How do you get soldiers from space to ground without killing them? The answer involves trajectory geometry that uses the planet itself as a shield, approaching on a vector that keeps the bulk of the planet between the landing force and the defensive systems for as long as possible, timing the final descent approach to coincide with windows when sensor coverage is degraded by atmospheric interference, by the geometry of orbital mechanics, by deliberate preceding feints designed to draw attention elsewhere. The soldiers performing these insertions are among the most highly trained individuals in the Imperium. Not because the combat they will face on the ground is beyond their skills, though it may be, but because the approach itself is a test of nerve unlike almost any other military experience. You are falling through the sky above a planet that is actively trying to kill you, in a vehicle that is as slow and as conspicuous as possible on a trajectory calculated by people who are already out of communication range. And if you survive the descent, you emerge into the ground war, into the world of slow blades and personal combat and all the terrible intimacy that the Holtzman shield physics demands. The fortifications built to defend against this kind of warfare look nothing like the fortresses of previous military traditions. There are no long, straight walls optimized for rifle fire along a defended perimeter. There are no artillery emplacements covering overlapping fields of fire. The architecture of Dune universe fortifications is built around a different tactical reality. The enemy will reach your walls. The enemy will breach your outer defenses. The question is not whether you can prevent that, but how much you can cost them for every meter of progress. The siege of the Fremen, those underground fortress cities carved into the rock of Arrakis, are the most fully described examples of this defensive architecture in the novels. They are not designed to present a hard outer shell. They're designed as a series of increasingly difficult interior spaces, each transition point defensible by a small number of skilled fighters against a larger force, each corridor narrow enough that the attacker's numbers become a liability rather than an asset. 2 people defending a narrow tunnel against 10 attackers is a very different tactical equation than 2 people defending an open field. In the tunnel, the attackers cannot bring their full force to bear simultaneously. The defenders can hold indefinitely against odds that would be hopeless in open terrain. This is the architecture that Holtzman shield physics demands. Not open strength, but interior depth. The great citadels of the great houses follow similar principles at a grander scale. Multiple concentric defensive lines, each one slower and more personal than the last. Outer perimeters where conventional kinetic weapons might still be useful against unshielded attackers. Inner corridors where shields are assumed and every engagement is blade work. And at the center, the innermost rooms where the highest value individuals are protected by the finest personal fighters available. Swordmasters, trained household guards, the family members who have themselves trained since childhood in the slow blade arts. The design of these spaces rewards patience. It punishes aggression. It turns every meter of penetration into a transaction. And the currency of that transaction is the lives of the attackers. A determined defender with a blade in a narrow corridor is worth 10 impatient attackers. The architecture knows this. The architecture was designed around this. Let us descend now into the deepest part of the ship, into the place where the drive technology lives, where the physics of travel becomes a physical, audible, tangible thing. The full drive in the Dune universe is not a single technology. The Holtzman effect is a family of applications, all derived from the same underlying mathematics that produces different results at different scales and power levels. The personal shield is one application. The space folding drive is another. And the drive is the technology that more than any other defines the experiential texture of life in the Imperium. A Holtzman fold drive works by manipulating the dimensional stress field of local space to create a geometric shortcut between 2 points. The mathematics of this manipulation are so complex that without the prescient guidance of a guild navigator, the fold is essentially random. You might emerge in the destination system, or you might emerge inside a star, or you might not emerge at all, occupying a permanent location in non-space that has no coordinates in normal reality. The navigator's role in this process is not to operate the drive, it is to perceive. A navigator, floating in their tank of spice-saturated gas, their body so thoroughly transformed by melange that they barely resemble a baseline human being, uses their drug-enhanced prescience to scan the possible fold trajectories and identify the one safe path. Then they transmit that path to the ship's navigation systems and the drive executes it. This means that every fold jump is a unique event. No two navigators perceive the same path. No two jumps follow the same trajectory through non-space. The mathematics that the drive executes is different every single time, generated fresh by the navigator's perception, dependent on the specific quantum state of local space at that precise moment. What this produces acoustically is extraordinary. Because the drive is executing different mathematical instructions on every jump, the resonant frequencies it generates are never exactly the same. There is a consistent baseline hum, the fundamental frequency of the drive's core operation, but layered over it are harmonics and subharmonics that shift and change as the fold progresses. Crew members who have made many jumps describe the sound as something between a cathedral organ and a deep ocean geological event. A sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, vibrating not just through the air but through the hull and through the bones. Between jumps, in transit, on conventional drives, the ship settles into a much more regular acoustic signature. The gravity stabilizers, which maintain consistent internal conditions while the ship accelerates and maneuvers, operate at a fixed frequency. This frequency is carefully calibrated to be below the threshold of conscious perception for most humanoid species, felt as a very slight pressure in the chest rather than heard as a tone. But it is always there, always present. The physical proof that the ship's systems are maintaining the envelope of habitability that separates the crew from the lethal vacuum outside. There is something profoundly moving about that when you sit with it. The idea that the most fundamental comfort available to a human being in the void of space is a vibration in the floor beneath your feet. Not words, not warmth, not even light, just the steady, reliable, mechanical pulse of a system doing its job. The universe is cold and indifferent and vast beyond comprehension. But the ship hums, and the hum means you are still alive. The gravity stabilizers deserve a deeper examination because they represent one of the most ingenious applications of Holtzman field physics beyond the combat context. In normal space, a ship undergoing acceleration imposes a constant stress on its structure and its crew. At the accelerations required for practical interstellar maneuvering, an uncompensated human body would be crushed against whatever surface the acceleration is pressing it toward. The history of early space travel in the pre-Holtzman era involved elaborate structural engineering solutions to this problem. Specialized couches, pressurized suits, complicated shock absorption systems. The gravity stabilizer solves this by creating a localized Holtzman field inside the ship itself, calibrated to oppose and smooth out the net acceleration force experienced by the contents of the field. The crew still feels a consistent one-gravity environment regardless of what the ship's drive is doing outside that bubble. The field itself absorbs the variation and delivers a constant. The mechanical complexity of doing this in real time, continuously adjusting the field parameters to match a constantly changing acceleration vector, requires computing infrastructure that represents some of the most sophisticated, non-thinking machine technology in the Imperium. And that infrastructure produces a sound. A very specific, very regular, rhythmic sound, like a slow pulse, a measured beat that underlies everything else on the ship. Long-haul crews learn to time their breathing to it, unconsciously. It is not a meditative practice they choose. It is something the body does on its own, finding the rhythm of the most stable, predictable thing in its environment and synchronizing to it. The lungs fill on the pulse, the heart rate settles near a harmonic of it. Sleep, when it comes on the beat. This is not a detail invented for dramatic effect. It is a logical consequence of the physics being described. A Holtzman field operating at the scale of a ship's interior, compensating for continuous acceleration variation, would have to pulse. The field cannot hold a perfectly static value and still respond dynamically to change. It breathes, it cycles, and the ship breathes with it. And now, finally, we come to the end of everything, to the place where the violence stops and the physics of travel become purely contemplative. Between engagements, between systems, between the moment of violence and the next horizon, there is a long, quiet space that every soldier and every traveler and every navigator and every crew member in the Dune universe has to pass through. The transit, the crossing, the void. The void is not nothing. It is the most information-dense environment in the universe if you have the instruments to read it. It is full of radiation, particles, magnetic fields, the distant gravitational signatures of objects so large and so far away that their influence barely registers. But to human senses, to the unaugmented biological systems that evolution designed for a planetary surface, the void is silence. It is absolute, total, sensory absence of everything that the human nervous system was built to parse. And the crews who cross it carry their own light with them. Not just electromagnetic light, though they carry that too. Every viewport, a tiny argument against the darkness, but the light of community, of shared purpose, of the institutional knowledge that a military or trade vessel represents, of the collected tactical wisdom that every swordmaster and every strategic planner brought aboard. The Imperium's military tradition acknowledges this explicitly. Long transit crews are required to maintain formal structures, rank hierarchies, duty schedules, shared meals, because the social infrastructure is not a luxury. It is mission critical. The void does not kill people with radiation or cold or suffocation, not if the ship is functioning. It kills them with the slow dissolution of the self that happens when no external reference point remains to push against. The Spacing Guild addresses this differently than the military does. For a navigator, the void is not an absence to be endured, it is a medium to be read. The spice-saturated consciousness of a fully transitioned navigator perceives the folds and currents of non-space as a kind of landscape, with features and textures and territories that baseline human perception cannot access. To a navigator, the void between the stars is not empty. It is extraordinarily, overwhelmingly full of the branching possibilities of every path not taken, every fold not made, every trajectory that ends in catastrophe rather than arrival. This is the loneliest consciousness in the known universe, the mind that can see everything that might happen and must choose every single time the narrow corridor between all the ways things go wrong. This is the final and most profound lesson of the mechanics of interstellar warfare in the Dune universe. That the most lethal battlefield is not the one where lasguns and shields create pseudo-atomic explosions. It is not the narrow corridor where two blade fighters press against each other in the terrible patience of slow combat. It is not even the sky above a defended planet where a landing craft falls through fire. The most lethal battlefield is the one inside the mind of a person who has been too long in the dark, too far from anything familiar, too intimate with the physics of their own mortality. The Holtzman shield makes combat personal. The slow blade makes it intimate. The void between the stars makes it existential. And all of it, every dimension of warfare in this universe, orbits the same central truth that Herbert placed at the heart of everything he wrote. The human capacity for endurance is both the most fragile and the most indestructible thing in the known cosmos. The spice must flow. And underneath that famous phrase, underneath all the political machination and ecological allegory and religious mythology of the Dune universe, is a physics argument, a precise, internally consistent mechanical claim about what happens when you build a civilization on the intersection of unstoppable technology and immovable physics. You get a universe that forces human beings to confront each other directly, personally, intimately, because the technology itself refuses to allow any other mode. The lasgun is powerful. The shield is powerful. Together they are apocalyptic. And so neither is used against the other, and humanity fights with blades and the universe hums. Let all of that settle now. The physics of light and shield, the calculus of the slow blade, the acoustic loneliness of the transit void, the geometric puzzle of orbital insertion, the resonant pulse of the fold drive finding its path through non-space. All of it real in its way. All of it internally consistent, carefully constructed over decades by one of the most systematic world builders in the history of speculative fiction. A universe that